For millennia, our society has been free of crime and war, living in perfect peace.
Oh, I know what this is. You've been able to sustain world peace because you have one night a year where you all run around robbing and murdering each other without consequence.
That's right.
What? It's like The Purge, Morty. That movie, The Purge.
Oh, have you been here before?
No, but I've been to a few planets with the same gimmick. You know, sometimes it's called the cleansing or the red time. There was this one world that called it just Murder Night. It's a purge planet. They're peaceful, and then, you know, they just purge.
That's horrible!
Yeah. You want to check it out?
Hello, welcome back to my channel. This is Liv, where I talk about everything related to society and most of the time with a philosophical twist. So if you're new here, please don't forget to check out my channel and subscribe. Now, this video is inspired by the 9th episode of season 2 of the animation series Rick and Morty. Let me just start by giving a very brief overview of the episode to set up my topic. Basically, Rick and Morty travels to a planet where everyone pretty much lives in peace for every day of the year, besides one day where they're free to do all sorts of illegal stuff like kill and steal and rob without any consequences, and they call that day the Purge Festival. The basic idea is to purge everyone's negative emotions and violent tendencies in one day so that they could live in peace for the rest of the year. However, towards the end of the episode, we kind of find out that this periodic purge has actually been designed by the rich and powerful sort of aristocratic class because they enjoy watching the poor people kill each other. So this girl from the purge planet, with the help of Rick and Morty, goes and kills all those rich and powerful people who have designed the purge because she wants to remove the purge festival. However, here is the irony. So after the collapse of their social structure, people in the planet seems to have returned to a state of nature.
Right. I need food. Who's got food for that guy?
I do, but this is for me.
Can't you make some more?
Oh, sure. And while I'm making food for everyone, who takes care of my kids?
I'll take care of your kids if I get some extra food for it.
Extra food?
Well, I'm not gonna do extra work if we all get the same.
Who's gonna keep track of who gets how much food for how much work?
Hello, I can do that. I'll keep track of everyone's food. You know, in exchange for food.
That's not a real job.
Oh, and making food is...
You son of a bitch.
Now, when conflict arises in the state, guess what they decide?
Too much aggression here. What if we designate a period of time during which we can all get this hate, murder, and rage out of our system?
Yes, they decide to create a purge festival. So it's as if nothing has happened. It all goes back to the beginning. And there's also this really chilling truth towards the end of the episode where Morty reflects on all his violent dispositions shown whilst he was in the context of the Purge Festival, and he felt really guilty. He felt as if he wasn't himself, and he wanted Rick's reassurance that he really isn't that sort of person, that sort of violent person. So basically, Rick invented a lie to tell him that he was under the influence of chemicals when he really wasn't. Now, this episode was particularly interesting to me because it raises a lot of interesting questions about human nature. Are we naturally violent or peaceful, kind or spiteful? Is the purge a worse idea or a better idea than everyday violence? These are the questions that I kind of want to go through in this video, even though, just to mention in advance, I won't be able to give a definitive answer to most of them. And honestly, I think very few people can. A lot of people like to ask the question, are we good or bad by nature? Everyone knows the Bible story of Adam and Eve. It depicted people in a state of absolute goodness or innocence before Eve got tempted to eat the apple. And this, for some people, seemed to support the idea that we're naturally good if without the influence of society. Because they think, well, there must be some reason that the biblical story came to be that way. Or maybe if you're religious, you would think at least mankind was supposed to be good before Eve sinned, and now we're all sinners. So we're kind of bad by nature because of how we are now. But for the non-religious people, how is this problem of good versus bad meant to be determined? Well, a lot of people use evidence from young children to support their claim of whether people are naturally good or bad. And you know what? The evidence kind of goes both ways. You can find young children, displaying acts of kindness out of their innate instincts or displaying acts of evilness, such as torturing animals because they sincerely just want to do that. But what I personally think is this. It doesn't make any sense to ask the question of human nature, are we good or bad? Because to begin with, good and bad are man-made terms. So their associated set of criteria are also man-made. Trying to ask this question of human nature kind of turns us all into hypocrites, because for all you know, we could have simply devised the set of criteria for goodness in accordance with how we perceive humans to be by nature. And then, by our criteria, we're good. But our criteria of good was devised in accordance with our understanding of human nature. So, it's like this matching up is kind of trivial if you think about it. What if we suppose that people weren't so hypocritical as to devise a criteria of the good according to how we really are? They devise a criteria for goodness based on, what they think is good. I think there's still two issues present even when we try to approach the question this way. Firstly, as a matter of fact, this criteria has differed drastically throughout history and culture. Consider the contrast between what the Greek and Romans considered to be good versus what Christianity considered to be good. So for example, the Greek and Romans considered that if you're strong and wealthy, you're good. But in the framework of Christianity, there's sort of this phrase called blessed are the meek. And even within the same temporal and cultural context, we would have a series of divergences among what different people think are good. More so, the same trait can be considered good and bad depending on the way or the degree to which people manifest it. So for example, some people think that working hard and striving to make as much money as you can through hard work is a show of diligence, which is a positive trait. But others think if you keep striving to make more and more money, that's greed. Even if you have acquired it through your hard work, it's still greed, which has negative connotations, and they just think, you should strive for other things in life, such as helping others. So this goes to show that the line between, the same trait in a person defined as good versus bad is actually quite a thin line. Secondly, if we try to devise a criteria of the good, which is not meant to fit how human nature already is, then this somehow implies that it's an ideal that people should strive towards. Well, if some traits need a bit of striving towards to be obtained, then they're clearly not innate. Hence, it seems like there's no possibility of presenting human nature as good. Okay, well, the thing here is that it seems like trying to figure out whether we're good or bad by nature doesn't really get us anywhere. How about we try a different substitute question that can get us to pretty much almost what we want to get? And it's a question that philosophers, historians, and sociologists have racked their brains over for centuries. Are we violent by nature? It's uncontentious that violence is bad and non-violence is good. So if we can kind of answer the question of are humans naturally inclined to be violent, then it seems like we have gotten as good as a substitute answer as we can get to the question of are we good or bad. This episode of Rick and Morty, as I have mentioned in the introduction, suggests that we are violent by nature. But let's first pause and look at what some other people have said on this topic. Among the foundations of political philosophy, there are two people who loom large: Hobbes and Rousseau. And the reason why I bring up those two people is because they have two absolutely contrasting conceptions of how humans are in a state of nature. Hobbes thought that the state of nature is a state of constant warring. And by this sort of warring, he didn't mean systematic warfare. This is something that we will flag for discussion later, but what he meant was small-scale fighting, like bickering between people or small tribes. So humans are innately prone to resorting to violence. This is why we need the state to take a monopoly on violence, because Hobbes believed that it will decrease violence overall. Rousseau, on the other hand, called the primitive man a noble savage, meaning that he is naturally kind and non-violent. It is only via socialization that people have acquired different negative traits that drive them towards violence, such as the current form of organized warfare. Now the thing is, neither of them really used any substantial evidence to back up their claims. They just philosophized. The typical armchair philosopher. So let's take a look at people who have supported the discussions with stats. When we approach this topic, of course, we can't ignore Steven Pinker's best-selling book a few years ago, The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he basically used a series of statistics to argue that violence has been exponentially decreasing since prehistoric times. Even if we factor in the spike in violence caused by the two world wars, the trend still holds. So is this a conclusive conclusion? Well, not necessarily. So one of my favorite channels, Then and Now, actually did a video kind of refuting Pinker's claim. And this video is linked here. So basically, he analyzed the loopholes in Pinker's analysis and gave some data to show that we are actually more violent than our ancestors.
In no cases could one find any evidence of intergroup conflict. Commenting on the total record, Henry de Lumley has written that the first Homo sapiens do not seem to have led the warrior's life so often attributed to them, for their pathology is not marked by a traumatology other than that caused by the accidents of everyday life. And anthropologist Leslie Sponsel has written that during the hunter-gatherer stage of cultural evolution, which dominated 99% of human existence on the planet, lack of archaeological evidence for warfare suggests that it was rare or absent for most of human prehistory. So that 15% for this period, so far on scant evidence, we could bring it down to 2%. Fry writes that the idea that 15% of prehistoric populations died in warfare is not just false, it's absurd. So what happened? War likely emerged at the end of the Ice Age with the advent of farming around 10,000 BC. This came with a big shift in socio-economic conditions, including a shift to sedentary existence, settlements becoming bigger and denser, a growing population, resource concentration, harvests stored for example, excess resources, hierarchy, enclosures showing signs of social segmentation, clear inequality, and the use of salt, seashells and obsidian to trade with. It seems like the first wars and increases in violence were not associated with savages, hunter-gatherers, or nomadic tribes, but with civilization.
I would encourage you to check out this video and decide for yourself which side you want to believe. So it seems like we have evidence that points both sides. I am no qualified historian or anthropologist. It would be quite difficult for me to dig up my own data to assess the claims of both sides, and I'm pretty sure there will be countless other research that goes to support either side. So just assume that the conclusion is somewhat inconclusive and there's still debate going on. However, the point that I wanted to bring up is actually this. That's stop choosing sides. Instead, let's look at it from a different angle. Why must we interpret violence as something that has been systematically on the increase or decrease? I think this approach itself is wrong, and it stems from this kind of very naive and simplistic conception of history as a linear progression. You know, we must either progress or regress in some direction. A lot of thinkers since modernity has held this idea that history has to be progressing towards some final end, and they often think that this end is constituted by some sort of necessity or rationality. And I think this view is just really naive when, if you think about it, like, what is this end? So if we throw away the idea that history has to progress towards some direction, when you accept the fact that history is quite random and there is no final end to be achieved, no final ideal human society to be realized according to how our natures really are, then history is just a series of events that happen to be. Why can't we think about violence the same way? It's neither increasing nor decreasing. It's just fluctuating, and it's undertaking different forms. And the form and the level that it is at a given era really depends on the characteristics of the era. However, now we're at this point and we cannot avoid discussion of the change in the form of violence, which is really from like, you know, Hobbesian warring state of nature to, well, the organized warfare. Towards the end of the Rick and Morty episode, we see this bunch of rich people sitting there having a banquet and hosting the yearly purge because they think it's a great idea for people to like release their violence and it's like their entertainment. Okay, for some people it may remind you of like the really creepy rich people in Squid Game who also spoke really cringeworthy English. But there are also other, deeper implications behind this representation. During the majority of human history, when we had organized warfare, it was basically this small group of people with wealth and power who sat in the comfort of their homes, whilst the poorer people were often conscripted against their will to fight and suffer and die in thousands and millions. So what I am saying is that this part of the episode can actually also be read as a subtle shade on the nature of organized warfare. It's like this small group of rich and powerful people who are not fighting and they're dictating the rest of the masses to fight whilst they sit in the comfort of their homes. Now it comes to the question of asking, must we have organized warfare? Because the fact that organized warfare exists seems to be strong evidence in favor of the innate tendency of violence in our natures. And here's why. Let's just suppose there are basically two reasons why wars are started. So it's either that the rulers want it or the people want it. If the episode stopped at the point where this ruling class was killed and people kind of lived happily ever after, then it would be strongly implied that organized warfare happened because the rulers want it, and only because the rulers want it. They wanted it because they weren't the ones directly penetrating or suffering from the violence, and they could get like power and wealth from winning wars, so why not? But the sinister thing was that the episode didn't stop there, which kind of drives us to consider the other possibility, which is also reflected in a series of episodes in human history, that countries sometimes go to war at the will of the general citizenry. So consider the end of this episode. It was the people who came together and decided that they should implement a purge festival. So instead of random small incidences of violence every day, they think it's better for violence to take place on a large-scale organized warfare level within specific timeframes. So the message here seems to be that humans have this innate tendency for violence that needs some form of release systematically at certain time intervals, and organized warfare is the form that they have devised for it. This is what the animation series seems to imply about human nature. Well, let's have a brief look at what history says about it. So roughly, there is this kind of research but kind of folk historical theory going around for really long. Probably a lot of you have heard about it, that big wars tend to occur at intervals of around 75 years. So if you look at this graph, it supports that theory. And the reason behind it is that 75 years is around the time that people who have had direct experience of the former major warfare died out, and the younger generation turns belligerent because they are basically unaware of how catastrophic wars are. They have forgotten the lessons from the older generation, so once they have some sort of unvented anger or want better conditions and, you know, just have whatever sentiments, those sentiments for power and money and violence kind of outweigh their awareness of how catastrophic wars are. So this might make a lot of psychological sense to a lot of people, and I can understand that, and I'm not going to like support or refute it, because I personally am not such a big fan of thinking about history in terms of determinate cycles that must happen at certain intervals in certain ways. I don't think about it in a sort of necessity, you know. I think about it in a sense of it just happened to be. That's why I'm not going to either support or refute this theory, because it seems to be that 75 years is the rough interval as things are now. So if we accept this sort of statistics as just how things are, even if not by necessity, it still is just how things are, then it seems that we have an innate tendency to violence. Evidence strongly points this way. Is there anything we can do about it? since, we clearly think violence is bad. The reason why I asked the question of, is there anything we can do about it? It stems from the idea that, there are a lot of things that we can say of human nature. Lots of them are probably not good by our normal standards nowadays. But you know what? Civilization is about a process of changing these aspects of human nature. Civilization is about trimming and cutting and adjusting different aspects of our human natures to fit the standard of our current civilization. So the whole point of civilization is that we don't act like primitive savages. So yes, it may be in our nature to be X, Y, and Z, but it doesn't mean that we have to constantly, throughout history, throughout human development, still exhibit the traits of X, Y, and Z as strongly as we would if we lived as primitive savages. So here is one idea that has been inspired in me by this episode. What happened with Morty was that he turned violent after seeing The Purge close up. He kind of got drawn into the overall mood of The Purge and he became violent as well. He suddenly felt this inclination for violence that he seems to have never felt. As far as we know him as a character throughout the series, he's been shown as someone who's very meek and kind and never violent. So the question would be, what happened to him in that episode? Well, I think the whole idea behind it is this. Human nature is complex. It is already really hard to determine the proportion of our traits that would be attributed to genetics versus environmental upbringing. So this line is already really hard to draw. This sort of ambiguity perhaps leaves room for maneuver. I am by no means producing a full-fledged theory of how human nature is or how education or influence should be done, but just some ideas for thought. So the idea is that it seems to be there are many ingredients in this churning pot that we call human nature, and we still haven't really figured out precisely what ingredients there are that are just fundamental versus being the result of environmental influence, and we also don't really have a clear idea of extent to which each ingredient is rooted in our nature, how strongly they're rooted. So what if we tried to construct the environment of our society in a way that would bring out maximally the positive so-called ingredients in human nature and minimize the negative? Even if the tendency for violence is innate in humans, in the case of many people, it could remain largely dormant. If the person is generally not exposed to acts of violence around him and he's not exposed to sort of ideas or perspectives that celebrates violence or warfare. Because think about it, a lot of people nowadays can't stand gore, gory representations of human bodies, whether on screen or right in front of you. But it seemed like people a few centuries back had a much higher tolerance for it, because the public entertainment at the time was literally public torture or public execution. Then it seemed like, it's this process of civilization and the changing social norms and values that kind of induced a shift in whatever we would call human nature, and people just became much more intolerant of gore and violence and that sort of thing. So it shows that it's possible, to change what is seen to be our innate tendencies or tolerances. So I guess what I wanted to say is that we probably won't ever figure out the precise ingredients to human nature. And of course, we know that we're neither innately good nor bad. And we definitely all do have some violent inclinations in all of us. But this doesn't matter, because what matters is how we want to craft our civilizations to bring out different aspects of ourselves and others. So here is all I wanted to say on this topic. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a comment and don't forget to like and subscribe.